So here we are, and I just wanted to welcome all of you today. It is noon, so we're going to go ahead and begin right now. My name is Jeff Geronimo. I am the e-learning design coordinator here at the Faculty Development and Instructional Design Center, and I wanted to welcome all of you to today's session, which is Controlling Student Access to Materials in Blackboard. So a little bit more about what we're doing today, and just to let everyone know, what might this refer to, what specific questions do you have, but what we're really going to be looking at today is the adaptive release feature, which is in Blackboard, and this is more of an intermediate advanced feature that we're going to discuss. So in today's session, we're really going to be focusing on that particular aspect. So we're going to take a look at the introduction as to what adaptive release is all about, and then we'll follow up on that by taking a look at some of the use cases and scenarios that you might expect to see and why you might want to use it, as well as where and when might be the most appropriate time to use the adaptive release feature, and just to control or manage student access to your Blackboard content at any time. We'll then take a look at the specific features that embody the adaptive release feature. So it's not just one feature, it really refers to a whole subset of different features as well. So it's important to note that it's not just one specific thing, and there are very many other ones out there as well. So just to keep that in mind. And then we're going to head over into the demonstration. So I'll be able to share my screen to show an actual live demonstration of some of the features that you might find in adaptive release. So rather than just talking about it, you'll also be able to get to see it live. And then at the very end, we're going to wrap up with some recommendations and talk about, again, just to kind of encapsulate when you might use this. So just to keep all of this in mind, like I said again, we are going to be focusing more on the adaptive release feature as well as any of the other features contained within that for today's session. So a little bit more of an introduction and learning a little bit more about, well, what exactly is adaptive release? And so adaptive release is one of the most unique and like I said, it's a little bit more of a complex feature, but it's a wonderful feature because it allows you to release course content based on specific rules and criteria that you as a faculty member can create. So what does that mean? Well, in a sense, you can control which content is available to its students and under what conditions they're allowed to see it. Sometimes it might be directed towards one particular individual, or for the whole class, or maybe in just subset of groups. So this is something where you can control the way that content appears, and you can do this for a variety of reasons, primarily to accelerate or remediate course content. And so again, you can do this so that it affects the entire course, or maybe just a few students, or maybe if you have groups set up in actual groups of students. So that's really the simplest way to describe adaptive release. So again, it's really more of a feature that's built in. There's no other extra setup other than the actual setup you would do within adaptive release to make this work. But again, when you turn these features on and you enable them on a case-by-case basis. It's not enabled by default. So again, it uses specific rules and criterion that would essentially release the content that you want to be able to show to students. Whereas we already know, if you have taught online in Blackboard, or you probably just use Blackboard as a more of a blended component to allow access to your syllabi or other course content, the materials are already there. It's static. It's not going anywhere. Whereas if you really do want to have a much tighter control over those course content, that's when you might consider using adaptive release. So a little bit more about, again, when might you actually use adaptive release? Well, there's many different scenarios, and I've highlighted 6 of the more common ones here. You might use it, for instance, for makeup exams, for assessments. Maybe you might want to allow certain students, or maybe one particular student, to access an exam or an assessment. And by exam or assessment, I'm referring to the actual Blackboard test that's built into the system. And specifically, too, one of the more popular features is to allow additional assessment time. You'll notice later that I actually do have a handout that I will share with you that you may feel free to download that is more of a complex way to do this if you are in a position or ever will be in a position to allow assessment time, additional assessment time. What I will be showing here is going to be a little bit beyond the scope of this, so I have this handout in case you ever want to refer to it, and we'll get to that later. Other things that you might use adaptive release for besides exams and assessments might, again, as I mentioned before, if you really do want to have the ability to provide more of a self-paced learning path for your students. And you might find this more useful if you are truly going to be teaching an online course, or if you are teaching an online course. When we talk about setting customized learning paths, we really mean, well, if you're going to get away from having to release content all at one time, and you really want to be able to allow students to progress at their own pace, but to allow them that flexibility using constraints, then you may want to consider using adaptive release. So you may have a policy where students will be allowed to go as fast or as slow as they want through the course, but they have to understand that, for instance, if your course is organized in weekly format, maybe week 2 will not appear to them unless they've specifically completed week 1. So there's constraints if you want to provide this kind of flexibility but still have some type of control. That's when you might use more of a self-paced approach to using adaptive release. And like I said before, you can also use this for group materials if you do wish to use specific materials that are only targeted towards certain groups. Like I said before, if you want to provide more of a remedial materials or assessments for students based on their performance, you can use adaptive release. And that also ties in as well to if you want to give individuals or groups certain access, not just to Blackboard tools, but to content in general. So to look at a little bit more then as to a specific scenarios for each of these, we're going to take a look at those now. And again, these are just more of a rough scenario. They're not your any way, shape, or form the end-all, be-all. These are just a couple of the different scenarios that we've seen over the years or that faculty might experience in Blackboard in which they would want to resort to using adaptive release. So for the first one that I have here that you may want to consider is, for instance, if you do organize your course, and again, I speak really loosely when I mention all these scenarios. This really can be for a face-to-face course with a blended approach where you do use Blackboard. Otherwise, this also works well too for folks who are teaching online or thinking about teaching online. So for the first thing I have here mentioned is, let's say you do have a scenario where you have chapter materials or week 1 or week 2 materials. They're all posted in some sort of a chronological or thematic order. Maybe you might want to put all of your weekly folders or chapter folders, but only allow each of those folders to be released based on a specific prerequisite. So in this case, maybe you only want the Chapter 2 folder or materials to be available to students after they've specifically completed a quiz in Chapter 1. Or another specific scenario that you might have here would be, let's say you want to share specific materials with groups of students working on different projects. Maybe you have an assignment, but you have broken up your Blackboard course in 5 different groups. And you want each group to have a special assignment that's catered just to them. You can use an adaptive release rule. And of course, you technically, once you're starting to think about this and wrap your mind around this, you would be creating 5 different assignments or maybe 5 different items, but each group will only be able to see the one that was catered to them. They won't see the other 4. So that's how adaptive release would work in that kind of a sense. And another more related item is if, let's say, you happen to teach a course and your Blackboard course is actually a combined section of graduate students and undergraduate students. So let's say you're teaching a 394, which is an undergraduate course, and a 494 for graduate students, and you happen to have them all in one shell, but you want to be able to differentiate certain items that are only supposed to be viewed by certain students, and you can do this in this kind of a scenario. As I mentioned before, you can use adaptive release to do really advanced techniques such as allowing students to have additional time on a specific quiz. And as I'll foreshadow now, to do something like this truly, this actually allows, this really does require you to create a duplicate test. So you'll actually have two different tests. But again, I will have a handout that I will be pushing out here in the chat area fairly soon so that you can download and view that at your leisure. And I actually just did that now. So you'll see in the chat area there's a link to a handout in case you are interested in learning a little bit more about how to do this if you're ever in that position to do something like this. And then again, another scenario that you might have in this particular case is, let's say you have some topics, and or in a case where I actually have been teaching an online course this semester through the College of Education, and because this particular course that I'm teaching requires the students to really understand and view the policies of the syllabus, I've created a particular syllabus that they need to view, and there's a special button that they would need to click that says, yes, I have viewed the syllabus, and yes, I've agreed to the terms outlined of the syllabus, because what I've done is, if they don't hit that and acknowledge that they've read the syllabus, the rest of the course content in the course won't be available to them. So I've had some students who have emailed me, not very many, thankfully, who have said, oh, I have not been able to see any of the other course content. And I said, well, did you read the syllabus? And did you see at the very end of the syllabus that there was an acknowledgement process where you had to click specifically say, yes, you've read it. If you didn't see that or click it, then you wouldn't have been able to see the rest of the content. So that might seem a little bit silly to some, but for me, it really did help me gauge who really was reading the syllabus and who did acknowledge the content in the syllabus before moving further. So that was a way for me to control the access to the content. I wanted them to specifically go in specific steps before they went on. So these are just a couple of the use cases and scenarios, and as I said, you can feel free to think of other ones, and if you have questions along the way, especially while I'm doing the demonstration a little while here, feel free to field them in the chat area, and I'll be able to try to address those within the time that we have here today. So moving on, now that we've kind of looked at the use cases and the scenarios, let's take a look at more about what are the actual features of adaptive release. What actually makes this possible? So you'll notice here in this screenshot that I have a couple things here, and this is, as you'll see here, this is just a special regular area in Blackboard. I've got some folders laid out, some sample folders, and you'll notice that to be able to see adaptive release and to configure it, you'll definitely want to be able to, as you may remember, to turn edit mode on. And once you hover over any of your folder, and by the way, this adaptive release can technically be applied to almost any content link, any folder, any item, any file, even a discussion thread or forum in your particular course. But what you can do then is highlight over any of those content, and you'll notice here in the screenshot I've moused over the folder, and once the down arrow appears, I can see the drop down arrow, and I see specifically 3 particular links related to adaptive release. There's a regular adaptive release, an adaptive release advanced, and a set review feature. So for the purposes of today, we're really going to focus more on the adaptive release and set review. I do want to highlight a little bit more about what each of these features do. So when you do go ahead and try to experiment with adaptive release, you will see these 3 options every time you mouse over and click the down arrow for any content item in your course. But the first thing that we have here is just regular adaptive release. This is really the bulk, and I find that the most commonly used adaptive release feature. This is just the regular adaptive release, and we'll take a look and see what specifically you can control. But what makes this really basic is that it really just has the simple rules that you want to apply just to one particular item in your course. So let's say you'll notice here that the only reason why I even have this this contextual menu open is because I actually, judging from the screenshot, I want to do something to this week 6 folder. I want to actually restrict this folder and not make it available until a specific prior action has happened. That's why I'm really even in here to begin with. So in this adaptive release area, in this first option, I want to just do one particular criteria. And that's really what I'm going to be doing. So that's when I might be going to that area. Let's say, though, that you want to create multiple rules, more advanced rules that combine certain criteria. As we'll see later in the different slide, you can control item by grades, by dates. If you want to create more of those multiple rules, I will just caution you that I urge you to test that out first. And like I said, given the time that we have, we may not be able to cover the intricacies of this, but I will say that once you've gotten the handle of the basics of adaptive release, learning a little bit more about the advanced feature really isn't going to be too much for you. And then the other final thing that we're going to be taking a look at here is the set review status. And what this really does is it really allows you as a faculty member, if you just really want to give students a way to check off any material or content that they've already viewed or they've confirmed that they've reviewed, you can enable that. And by default, this is a feature that I find that not a lot of people really know about. And it is set off, it's turned off by default, but let's say, I've had students many times and faculty who have said, well, is there any way that I could have my students somehow check off that they've seen something or that they've read an article? So if, let's say, you have a very heavy reading heavy course and you want them to read each article, you can give them this option to provide more of an interactive way to check off that they've actually read an item or viewed an item by enabling a set review status. The only reason why I have this here as part of the adaptive release feature is that even though it's a separate feature, not exclusive to adaptive release, you can actually combine this with other specific criteria. So for instance, I can go in and let's say, again, in the screenshot, this is a very general screenshot, but maybe I don't want this week 4 folder to appear until students specifically check off that they've done the week 3 readings or the week 3 content. So this is just the 3 of the basic features, but what we really do want to focus on is the actual criteria and the rules that you can use to enforce that kind of control. So again, if you have any questions, feel free to field them in the chat box, and I'll try to get to those as soon as I can. So now let's take a look again, as I mentioned, the different rules and the criteria. So in the basic adaptive release feature, you have a set of 4 primary criteria in which you can use to enforce that type of control. You'll notice here that you have the date, membership, grade, and review status, which is why I mentioned that set review status in the previous slide. So if you want to control a specific item or folder, remember you can apply these adaptive rules to almost anything in a Blackboard course, but more popularly the content item. But if you want to control by date, this means that if you apply an adaptive release date rule to an item, that particular item is only going to be released on, until, or between a specific date and the time that you particularly prescribe. So as an instance, if you have content that you want covered in a specific order, as I mentioned before, let's say you have week 1, week 2, all the way to week 8, and this is the most common thing that many folks, even myself, might do. I don't want week 2 to appear unless it's actually week 2 as stated in the syllabus. So maybe week 1 is May 1st and week 2 is May 7th, for instance. I don't want week 2 to show up until May 7th, and on that date, that folder will become available to everyone. So that is probably the most basic criteria that many faculty might choose to use if you do want specific content released only at a certain time. So if you're still thinking about how this might actually work, again, I'll demonstrate this in the demonstration in a little while here, so you can learn a little bit more about how you might do that. And again, the other criteria that you can do is, rather than date, is you can do it by membership. And what this means is you can control the way an item appears. You can allow an item in Blackboard to appear only to specific users or groups of users. So if you do have if you have groups set up in Blackboard, maybe 5 groups with 5 students in each, or just specific users, you can give the item you can allow those items to be available and viewable only by specific users. So as an example, maybe if you have a student who is struggling in your course and you have a particular assignment that you only want that person to have access to, you can create an assignment but only have that available to a specific membership. In this case, to that specific user, and that's simply a matter of putting in their ZID or their user ID so that only that student will be able to have access to it. Another example as stated here is if you want certain assignments to be viewable to specific groups of students, or in that case, like I have mentioned here, into one group, or maybe if you want it to be available to group 2 or 3, that might be when you might have this membership availability. And this is also the criteria, by the way, if you did download that handout that I have available on extending time on tests. You will primarily be using the membership criteria so that you only allow specific students to have access to that particular test. Another criteria, which I've also done myself many times, is allowing items only to appear if there was a specific grade on a prerequisite item. So let's say you have a graded item. Well, this particular item, let's say week 5 folder. The week 5 folder won't be released or available to any students unless that particular student achieves a certain score on a previous item. So to wrap your mind around that, let's say I have an example here. This is if you've created multiple review packages. Maybe you've given them some practice exams or maybe graded exams. You have a particular folder that will release to students who've actually mastered the content. Maybe they received a 70% or higher on that exam. So that folder with the future content will be available to them. Otherwise, if there are students who somehow have achieved maybe less than that, failed, or maybe in this case 69% or lower, they will have a special folder that will contain remedial content that will only be viewed by those students who achieved that low score. So this is when you might use that grade criterion. You will be able to, you'll see in the demonstration how exactly you can control this. You can actually release an item based on just an actual attempt on, let's say, an assignment, a Blackboard test. This obviously, as you'll note here, really applies to achieving a grade on a specific gradable item in Blackboard. So you couldn't, let's say, allow week 5 folder to release based on a passing grade on an item, for instance. You can't achieve a passing grade on an item because an item is not gradable in Blackboard. You can only grade certain things like tests, wikis, blogs, discussion forums. So just to make sure that you have that logic in your mind, that's when you would particularly use this. Another one would be if you wanted, again, as I mentioned before, that check mark box. If you want to be able to provide a review status, so let's say you do have this weekly folder or a specific folder. You don't want to have that folder available unless a previous folder was marked as reviewed manually by the student. So if it was marked as reviewed, then that particular folder or content item will be available. So again, like I said, if you do have a week 5 folder, you don't want to have week 5 folder available unless a student checks off that they've read week 4. Or in this case, you don't want them to see week 4 unless they've checked off week 3. And as I mentioned, once I do the demo, this hopefully might make it a little bit more clear to you. But these are really the 4 basic criterion that you will see in the adaptive release features. And once you've kind of been able to experiment and work with these different criteria, you can then combine these. You'll notice that you can also combine dates and membership, or maybe a date and a grade, and you'll be able to see these in the demonstration that follows. So if you have any questions, again, please do feel free to let me know. What I'm going to do now, actually, as we move forward here, is I am actually going to go ahead and start showing a little bit more of that demonstration. So does anybody have any particular questions before I do the screen share? You can be silent, or you can go up to that checkbox and then give me a no or a yes, or just type it in. And go ahead and feel free to do that. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to go and share my screen here. So if you do have any particular questions while I'm doing this, I should still be able to see the chat box. With the beauty of technology today, of course, not everything will run as fast or as quickly as we would like. So if you do not see the browser show up right away, just bear with me and give yourself just a few moments based on your internet connection in your area. But what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go ahead and share my particular browser. So what you should be seeing at this point is you will actually see let me go ahead and put this up here. You should be able to see a Chrome browser here momentarily. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to go ahead and expand this just so that folks can see this. And like I said, if you do have questions or for some reason you can't see this, just feel free to let me know. Isabel did have a question. Can the student just open the material and have it marked as read? Yes, you can. What you'll notice later, as I mentioned in the adaptive release recommendations, generally it's usually best to use the set review status for an entire top-level folder rather than by item. However, you can do that, and I have done that several times in the past. So let's say you have a week 1 module, and inside you have 5 specific items. You can put a set review status for each one of them. That would work. However, if you do that and you want to combine that with adaptive release, it makes it a little bit harder to control that. Generally, if you want to combine that with adaptive release, you would need to set the review status not just for each individual item, but for the entire folder itself. So that just takes a little bit more work, but that you can make that happen. That's a good question. But what I have here is a particular screenshot of, or actually the Blackboard course shell that I'm going to demo here. Yes, Isabel, you won't be able to know if the student will read the material. That's why in my recommendations, if you do want to give them that option, you'll want to remind them that that's really for their benefit. You will not be able to know for sure. The only way you could really control that is through the actual adaptive release rule. But yes, that set review status is not related to adaptive release, but it's really just for the student's benefit. I mention it because you can combine it with adaptive release. So what I'm going to do here now is I'm going to go show a demonstration of the 4 of the different adaptive release criterion. So the first one that I'm going to show here is demonstrating how the date function works. And again, if you've been in previous Collaborate sessions before, you may notice that there might be a small lag in between every time we navigate to a different screen. So just allow your screen a few seconds to repopulate, and you will be able to see it as I do this. I'll try not to scroll too much. But for the first demonstration here, I want to show everyone here how you might actually use the date criterion. So if you notice, I have here in this particular shell, I'm an instructor in this particular course. I have the edit mode on, as we do need to have this on. And if you notice here, here's just an example. The content will be covered in a specific order, and you want content available only after it has been discussed in class. So as I mentioned before, let's say you want this topic 1 introduction to be available at a certain day and time. I will let everyone know that there's actually 2 specific ways to do this. One which is more preferred, but I'm going to show both. So if I want to make this apply an adaptive release date rule to this, all I need to do is hover over this introduction, click on the down arrow, and click on the adaptive release. And you'll notice as we go to the next screen here, you see a couple of the different criteria, but what we want to focus on is on the date. So you'll notice here that you can allow this item folder, in this case we're applying this rule to a folder, we can choose to have this folder displayed only after or until or both. And I want to remind everyone that one of the problems or some of the common mistakes I see here is a lot of folks will actually just put in the day and time. So let's say I will allow this to be available only until Wednesday, May 1st let me do this up until 9 p.m. They forget that you need to make sure that you click on that radio checkbox. This makes sure that this activates the actual date criterion. So just be aware that if you don't click on that checkbox, it will not actually activate this date criterion. If you do want to have that item only displayed until a certain time, at which point after that particular date it will disappear from the student's view, you can check this box as well. But I just want to have this particular item displayed only after a certain day. So in this case, if this folder was a week 2 folder, and week 2 folder, according to the syllabus is not until May 1st, that's when I might use this date criterion. So I can go ahead and hit submit, and what it will do then is you'll notice as an instructor you are able to see that there was an adaptive release rule applied to this, as it says enabled adaptive release. Another way to do this, which I also want to recommend as a best practice, if you are only wanting to control an item, or in this case a folder, just by a date and time restriction, I do want to let everyone know that the easiest way to do this, and the least cumbersome way of doing this, is also just by hovering over that item, clicking the down arrow, and rather hitting adaptive release, go into the actual edit settings for that item, as if you were going to go back and edit the folder name. And if you scroll down, you will also see here that in the third option, you can also select the date and time restrictions here. And it's the same exact item. The only reason why I do, from a designer standpoint or a faculty standpoint, why you might just want to do this here is because if you do the regular adaptive release criterion for time and date, you may actually forget that you've set it. So maybe later on, if you've copied your course over and you forget, it may be cumbersome to go back and find what rule you applied, whereas it's just much easier. If only you're going to control the date and time of an item, it's best just to do it in the edit settings of whatever folder or item that you have. But otherwise, you can do it either way. I just wanted to show everyone here that there are technically two different ways of doing it. So that is what all I have to do for the date and time. So in this case, this topic 1 introduction will not be available until that May 1st. In case you're wondering, well, what if I need to get rid of that adaptive release? You can certainly do that, not a problem. Again, you just have to go back into that adaptive release setting and simply clear it. So to do that, just hover over that item, click the down arrow, go back into adaptive release. And in this case, you can simply just click the checkbox. That would simply just disable it, and then you could hit submit. And you'll notice now there is no more message that says enabled adaptive release, which means that whatever rule that you've previously applied is no longer there. Obviously, if you delete the entire item, of course, the adaptive release itself would get deleted as well. So that's just a small demonstration of the date. That is probably the most simplest feature that I know that currently most faculty will use, especially in an online course when you do need to control date access. This is especially important if, for instance, you want to control a midterm exam or an exam. So for instance, in all the online courses that I teach, I always typically try to have the exam pre-prepared and ready to go. But what I do is that even though it's in my shell, I won't actually have it visible to students. I specifically apply a date and time restriction so that it won't appear until the actual midterm date or that midterm period. And I also apply a date until, which allows that item to disappear after that date has passed. And so that's just, again, one of the simplest ways to control it using the date criterion. So the other way to, in addition to date, is you can also control student access to materials by doing membership. So this is the second demonstration I want to show everyone here. So to reiterate, when might you use this? Well, if you do have specific assignments that you only want certain groups to see, as well as if you have a combined graduate or undergraduate class in one Blackboard shell, which is the case for many faculty members. They might be teaching, two different sections, but they technically only are combined in one shell. You can release certain content only to one group. So what I will show here is just some ways to do that. Of course, the actual scenario in which you might actually use this can vary, but you can, feel free to be creative and see how this might be applied to just your particular classroom. So for instance, let's say if I have two specific assignments here. And let's say I already have groups of students set up in this particular course. I actually physically went in and set up Blackboard groups in this particular course. And I only want Team 1, which is my name for the group, I only want Team 1 to see assignment 1, meaning I only want them to actually work on that. And I have a second assignment here that I only want Team 2 to see. So if I set up everything properly, what it will look like for every student who is in Team 1, they'll only be able to see assignment 1. They won't see assignment 2 because they're not assigned to that given the membership criteria. And similarly for assignment 2, only Team 2 members will see that. So to be able to do this, again, let's go back into assignment 1 here. And by the way, just in case you're curious, these are not actually assignments. They're simply just items. I've just put them here as placeholders. But the adaptive release, as I mentioned before, can be applied to pretty much almost any item, but not all, but most. in Blackboard. So this is just a placeholder. But let's say I wanted to go ahead and allow only Team 1 to see just this assignment, Assignment 1. I'll hover over that and click the down arrow, click Adaptive Release, and this time, instead of doing date, I'm going to go to Section 2, which is Membership. So you'll notice here in the membership area that I can control this either by giving access to only a few students. In this case, you'd have to go ahead and search for their name or their username. And when it says username, it wants you to add in their actual ZID number. So if this is my ZID, if I wanted to add, if I put this person in, only this person with this student ID will be able to see this particular item. But like I said before, what I want to do instead is actually allow a specific group, only that group and members of that group, to see this particular assignment. So to do this, as I mentioned here, I have course groups already set up. You won't see this area if you don't have groups of students set up in your course. So if you're interested in doing that, you're going to want to do that first. And we do have resources on our Teaching with Blackboard site if you've never set up groups before in Blackboard. But as I mentioned before, I want to allow Team 1 to be able to see this assignment. So to do that, I just highlight Team 1 and this little arrow here that's pointing to the right. I want to move this over to the selected item. So that's telling me that now this is the only group that will be able to see this assignment. So this, if you can think of file management purposes, let's say you have multiple groups of students inside Team 1. What this is saying is that Team 1, whoever's inside Team 1 will be able to see this. So let's say Team 1's group members change periodically. It does not matter. They will all be able to see it because the Team 1 group has been assigned to see this particular assignment. Hopefully that makes sense. So I'm going to go ahead and scroll, and actually I don't need to scroll down here. I've selected that, and I'm going to go ahead and hit Submit. So now, again, you'll see this enabled adaptive release, but that means that only members of Team 1, whoever's in Group 1, I don't know who that is right now, but I have already previously set this up, they'll only be able to see Assignment 1. And I can do the same thing for Team 2 as well. And again, if you forget and you don't know what particular criterion that you've given to an item or folder, all you need to do is go back into the adaptive release and check. And you'll see here that the setting that you just did was saved. So this tells me, okay, I actually applied a membership criteria to Team 1. And that means only Team 1 will be able to see this particular assignment. So this is particularly if you want to give access to an item or a folder just to one group or several students. So what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to hit cancel here, and I can again do this for assignment 2 if I wanted to. So let me just real quickly go in here and just check and see in my users and groups. I'm going to go check and see who is actually in my Team 1. So in my Team 1, I have about 6 students. So this tells me that in Team 1, I have 6 students. All 6 of these students, for everyone from Niels Bohr to Isaac Newton, these are the only students currently who will have access to that particular assignment. And again, like I mentioned before, this is just an item restriction by category of people, in this case, as we call it, membership. So the next thing that I want to show here is, we've already seen the date in the membership. The next thing I want to show you is the grade criteria. So one might use this, again, from my previous slides, if you only want to control the release of an item based on a previous criteria. So here's an example. Let me move this. Actually, this is perfect the way it is. I have a quiz here. This is a sample quiz, and then I have a Chapter 2 item. Let's say I have a course setup that has items similar to this, so if you want to just pretend here for a second, let's say you want this Chapter 2 item only to become available once students at least have attempted this first quiz. If they did not take the quiz, did not get a score, or did not do anything with the quiz, this Chapter 2 item will forever be unavailable to that student until they do so. So how do you do that? You simply apply the grade criterion in the sample quiz's adaptive release. So to do that, again, we do the same exact process. What we want to do is we do not want to apply the adaptive release to sample quiz. We want to apply it to the item. Remember that when you apply adaptive release to something, that means you're telling that item or folder that you don't want it to be seen until a prerequisite action has been met. So I'm going to go ahead to this Chapter 2 item, go back into the adaptive release settings, and instead of the date and membership, we're going to scroll down to Section 3, which is the grade criterion. Now you'll notice that for this adaptive release grade setting, you can actually select several different conditions. You can only select one, but there's several different choices that you can choose from. So what you can do here is you can select a condition. You can say, well, I don't want this item to be available until the user has at least one attempt for this item, and you need to select from this drop-down menu what item you're talking about. Well, in this case, I have that quiz. So I'm going to click on this Select Grade Center column in this drop-down menu up here, and I'm going to go ahead and find that particular assessment that I want to be the indicator and the end-all, be-all, if you will, that will allow this item to be available. So in this case, I want that sample quiz. This is telling me right now that this item that we're applying the adaptive release rule will not be available unless the user has at least one attempt for this item. It doesn't matter if they passed it, failed it, as long as they've actually attempted it, they've gone through the quiz, completed it, then this particular item will be available. You can also further refine this, as I mentioned before, if let's say you wanted to apply adaptive release rules to accelerate or remediate student content. Maybe you have materials for those who have done really well and another set of materials for those who probably haven't done so well. You can then select a condition by a score or by a percent. And you can do it in terms of less than or equal to, greater than or equal to. Otherwise, you can do the same thing, but you have it between a range. So this particular test that I have here is actually worth 10 points. So let's say I was just to figuratively apply a grade criterion to this, and I don't want this materials to be available to students unless they've achieved at least, I'm going to throw out a number here, let's say at least between 8 to 10 points. I can go in and type in the 8 to 10 points. That means that if students score less than 8 points on the quiz, which would be 7 or below, the student won't be able to see this item. So that's how you might do that. But I'm going to keep this real simple here and just do the one attempt. I've always done this for all of my adaptive release rules that use the grade criterion. I usually just use the one attempt. In my experience, sometimes what happens is systems might not always function the right way, or maybe you might have a mistake in a rule or criterion, and I have had many students who might say, oh, I can't see something even though I've already taken the quiz. So to play it on the safe side, test it out first. Start out with the one attempt and see how that works. So what we're going to do now is I'm just going to leave it there, and I'm going to go ahead and hit Submit. So that's how I would do that for that sample quiz. So what that's telling me is that this item will not be available to students unless they've taken the sample quiz. And I may also have forgotten to mention this, but you can actually real quickly see this in action just by turning your edit mode off. If you turn it off, you'll notice that that quiz, that Chapter 2 item is no longer there. Remember that when you turn edit mode off, you get somewhat of a student's view. You don't get the true student view, but you can kind of see what it would look like currently to your students right now in the Blackboard course. I wouldn't recommend taking the quiz to see if it would unlock it, because since you have an instructor role in your course, the adaptive release rule may not unlock it. It may not, but I would recommend that you at least try to use a fake student account. We do have instructions for that on our NIU help pages as well if you're interested in doing that. Otherwise, you can just real quickly see here that the rule obviously is in effect right now because I no longer see that item. So to bring that back, I'm just going to go turn my edit mode back on, and there is my Chapter 2 item. Now the last one that I do want to show here is the review status, because this one's also something interesting. And like I said, the review status itself is not an adaptive release rule. As I mentioned to Isabel, it really is more for the benefit of the students. But you can combine it with adaptive release, and I can show you how that would be possible. So we're going to go ahead and take a look at the review status now. This is just another demonstration. So what I have here is I have 6 folders, 6 content folders. You can pretend that in this fictional course there's 6 weeks, and each week each student will be working inside each of these folders, completing the course content and everything else. One thing I want to want to point out, this is just a side note, a best practice. You'll notice that in this particular structure, I've actually put week 6 all the way at the very top. I've essentially ordered my folders in reverse chronological order. The only reason why I mentioned to folks to do this rather than doing it week 1 to 6 is what's nice about this, and especially if you do hide these folders using the date restrictions or some other type of adaptive release rule, it will assure students that they won't have to scroll excessively. It would essentially allow the top folder, or whatever the most current folder, to be at the very top. So it's really nice. You'll see this in action as I demonstrate this here in a second. But this is one of the reasons why, for some of my courses, if it is set up in that fashion, I do lay out my folders in reverse chronological order so that students won't have to scroll all the way to the bottom to get to the current folder. It's always at the very top. But to do this, let's say here, let me go ahead and turn edit mode off for a second here. You'll notice right now that when I turn edit mode off, a couple things happen. You only see week 1 all the way to week 4. And you see that there is a mark reviewed label. And this is what I meant. If let's say you decided not to use adaptive release at all, you can use the set review status, this feature here by itself. This is, again, by itself, just for the benefit of the students. This is allowing them to say, all right, I've already reviewed week 1. I can click on that, and it will be marked as checked, or marked as reviewed. But if, as a faculty member, I want to combine that with adaptive release, and let's say I have a week 5 and week 6 folder, which, if you remember, I had that there, but now that I'm demonstrating this, you no longer see this here. It's because I did not allow week 5 to be available unless students have marked week 4 as reviewed. So to demonstrate this, all I need to do is, as a student, if I say, yes, I'm done reading week 4, I can click the mark reviewed, and instantaneously week 5 automatically appears. It's very, very awesome. For some people, they may not be fazed by that, but for faculty and for students, it's a really powerful feature because it allows them to confirm that, yes, as a student, I said I'm done with week 4, but of course, as I mentioned to Isabel, you do have to realize that students can mark reviewed or mark unreviewed at any time, and this is not the final indicator that they've actually reviewed every single thing inside the folder. This is for pretty much for their benefit, but for students who might need this kind of a structure, this might be a way to do this. And like I said, you can not only mark it as reviewed, but you can also click it again to mark it as unreviewed. And when you do that, unfortunately, the week 5 folder or whatever adaptive release that you've applied that to is no longer there. So again, I can mark that as reviewed, and the week 5 folder is available. If I'm done with week 5, I can mark that as reviewed, and the week 6 folder will appear as well. So that's a really wonderful feature. But now you're probably wondering, well, how do I set that up? So very simple. I'm going to go ahead and turn my edit mode back on just so you can see this. And actually, before I do that, let me just mark those as unreviewed in case any errors appear. So I'm going to go back and turn my edit mode on. And let's say now I want to apply that same effect, that same structure to week 2. Let's say I do not want week 2 to become available unless a student has specifically marked week 1 as completed. Well, there's 2 things you need to do here. Well, actually, there's only one thing you need to do. You can do one of 2 things. You can go ahead and do that rule right now, or you can go and do as I've done before. I can go in, click the down arrow, and I can click on the set review status, and that will actually enable that for me. But if you forget to do that, not a problem. Blackboard will automatically prompt you, and you'll be able to do that on your own. So that's just one way to do it, but I've done that for all of my folders. But let's say I want the week 2 folder only to become available when the week 1 was marked completed. I simply go to the week 2 folder, click the down arrow, and click on the adaptive release. And we've already reviewed the date, the membership, the grade. The final thing that we're doing is the review status, which is section 4. So you'll notice here the little marker says this content item is visible to all users until a review status criterion is created. So what I want to do is I want to select the item that I want to be the indicator before this item will be available. Hopefully that made sense. I'll go ahead and click on Browse. And if you don't see this window pop up, that's not a problem. It's just simply asking me to find that item. So what I want to do now is I'll get this hierarchy, and it's going to ask me, well, which folder or item do you want to be the prerequisite? Well, I want the week 1. So I'm going to go ahead and click on the week 1. And you'll see as I click on week 1, it's telling me now that this week 2 folder will not be available unless the week 1 has been marked as complete by the student. So once I see that as a confirmation, I can go ahead and hit submit. And it's going to prompt me and say that the review stats will be turned on. I'll say yes, that's okay. And when that happens, you'll notice now nothing really magical happens, except you do see that in this particular week 2 folder, just as you've seen in week 5 and 6, the adaptive release is now enabled, in addition to the review that all the other folders have here. So to try this out, I'm going to go into and turn off my edit mode. And you'll see here that my week 1 folder here is still there, but my week 2 folder is not. So what I need to do as a student is once I'm done viewing week 1 and I know for sure I'm done and I'm ready to move on, I click on the mark reviewed, and all of a sudden my week 2 folder will appear. And I can continue my business as I can go. And again, as I've showed you before, I've done the same thing for week 5 and 6. So to unlock week 5, I need to say week 4 is done. To unlock week 6, I need to say week 5 is also done. So now as a student, I have all of my folders unlocked. So that's just a basic, really, the 4 major criteria that you do need to keep in mind when looking at the adaptive release. We only have a few minutes left here, but I do want to show you when I turn my edit mode back on that if, for instance, you do want to experiment with the other rules, if you click on the down arrow of any item to get back to adaptive release, if you instead go to Adaptive Release Advanced, this is if you want to enable the ability to create multiple rules or to combine special rules together. And you can go there and you can do that. I have resources that I will point you to in case you're interested in looking at that. But at this time, obviously, I don't have the ability to show all of that. But and as I mentioned before too, if you go into the regular adaptive release where we've been experimenting with all of the different memberships, you can combine several different criteria together. So you could, for instance, only allow Team 1 to see a certain item, and if and only if they also have attempted a grade for a particular test. So what this is telling me now is I've combined a membership and grade criteria for one item. This means that this particular item is only available to Team 1, and also only if each of those Team 1 members have completed a specific quiz. So that's just something else that I wanted to point out here. As I mentioned before, you can combine several different membership rules if you'd like to. Try to keep it simple though, because you can make it a little bit complicated, and you know, again, you want to try to at least stick to one membership criteria if you need to. I wouldn't try to do it too many times. And yes, Isabel, as you mentioned, it seems that adaptive release requires many clicks. Why it would be better than setting specific dates. That's what I'm saying. If you're only going to be controlling access to a particular item or folder simply by date and time, that is when you would simply go into the edit settings just for that item or folder. The adaptive release is for other things. If you're going to control something by membership, something by grade, something by review status. That's why this feature is particularly powerful. Yes, it's several more clicks, but as I mentioned before, if you're only going to control access to an item by date and time solely, then you don't really need to use the adaptive release rule. That's when you would simply just go back into your item settings and set your date time there. Okay, so let's say again if I wanted to go in and let's say if I wanted to make this particular folder, or let's say week 4, I'm going to go here, click on the edit setting. If I scroll all the way down, in the third option, I can select the date and time restriction. That I can do right then and there, because that's only going to control it by date and time. So again, I just want to reiterate that if you, and you'll see this in my best practices slide that I have available here in just a few moments. If you are only going to be controlling access to an item just by date and time, this is probably the best way to do it, to eliminate the need to do so many clicks. So very good question. So we really, at this point, come towards the end of this. If you have any questions, let me know. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to get back to my the slides here that I've had, just so we can wrap up today's session. But if you remember then that if you do have any particular questions, like I said, please feel free to field those to me now. As far as recommendations that I have, as I mentioned before, if you are going to be trying this out, a couple things. I would not use the review status. Again, I mentioned this already. If you're requiring students to complete tasks and you really are controlling content, so let's say you have a midterm exam and you actually do not want that midterm exam to be available until a certain date, don't use the review status, because students will be able to just click ahead, and that's not a strong indicator that they'll be able to finish that item. So don't use the review status. Only use it if you want the students to have that benefit to check off materials for just themselves. And again, as I told Isabel and everyone else here, just use the regular date and access rather than the date adaptive release, because it'll save you a couple clicks, and it will also save you from having to remember if you've actually added it, because you'll never know. Sometimes you may glaze over and forget that you've added that date time restriction. So it's easier just to do it in the regular settings. The other thing too, as I mentioned before, try to set those rules at the folder level for adaptive release at the top level rather than individual items, because sometimes it may just be a lot easier. So as you mentioned, as I've shown you before, you can apply those adaptive release rules to week 1, week 2, week 3, week 4. If you're going to do that to individual items, my best suggestion is just to make sure that you note which items you're applying those rules to, because you have to understand that even though you can see them as a faculty member, students won't be able to see them unless whatever criterion you've applied is met. And then, as I mentioned before, there is an ITS section of the website in our NIU site. If you're interested in testing out the actual rules, it would really do require you to enroll more of a fake student account. Some of you have this, some of you don't. Something good to have. And last but not least, as I mentioned, it's best just to keep things as simple as possible. Try not to use any advanced rules if it's really not necessary. And again, if you have any more questions, what I've done here at this point is you'll also notice that you can go into our Teaching with Blackboard site. I have a link that I will push out as some final follow-up information. If you don't have already known, we will have a scheduled upgrade to a new service pack. Not a super major upgrade, but just a minor service pack upgrade, which will allow some new features. So if you are interested in looking at what we have available for that, we do have preview sessions. I've led a few of them, and we'll have some future ones available. So please do feel free to check out our niu.edu/blackboard/upgrade if you do have questions about that, specifically just for Blackboard-related upgrade issues or questions. Again, if you do have particular questions about the content, I did just post a link to the archive page. You'll notice that you can view this archive. This is being recorded right now. You can view this later in our archive page. I've put a link to that in the chat box. And of course, if you do have any questions, please again feel free to let me know. It seems like everyone here didn't have much questions, but I do also want to let you know that just with any of our other workshops, we do kindly ask that you complete a link to a survey. I've also pushed that survey out here in the chat box area as well. If you wouldn't mind completing that survey, we're always being praised for the quality of our workshops, and we only hope to do even better and improve where we can to bring you even better workshops as the time goes on. So if you wouldn't mind completing that survey within the next 5 days, I really would greatly appreciate it. And again, if you do have any questions, feel free to send me an email. I am available for questions related to Blackboard, instructional technologies, as well as anything else that you might be interested in. If I can't answer those questions, I will be happy to refer you to another member of my staff. But we are here at the end of the hour. It is now 1:03, just a few minutes past our budgeted time. I want to wish everyone a wonderful day. It is obviously going to be a much nicer day, and we look forward to seeing the rest of you in many workshops to come. And again, if you have any questions, I'll stick around here for the remainder of the time. But again, have a wonderful day, and thank you very much for joining me. That's all.